I absolutely love worker placement games, so in this video I'm going to tell you which ones I think are the best. Worker placement simply means that the players have workers they can put on the spots, triggering some kind of action. Now, why this simple idea can lead to tons of great games is that by placing a worker, you often block the other players from going to that same spot. So it adds a layer of strategy. As you are constantly trying to prioritize what actions you need to take, you also have to consider what the other players might be trying to do on their turn. We're going to start off here as the simplest of the games, but also the one that kind of stretches the idea of worker placement maybe the most, and that game is Imhotep. In Imhotep, the players are going to be building the monuments of Egypt. To do that, you're going to be placing bricks onto boats that will then be sailed down the river to the various locations. The pyramids, burial chamber, obelisk. The unique part is that your workers actually are the bricks. You see, you're going to use those bricks to compete for spots on the boats. Depending on where you get to on the boats and what site they're sailed to, they'll come off in different orders and score you points. Imhotep is a pretty strategic game, even though it's not too complicated actually. So I think it's a good game to kind of bring out when you have maybe a 30-minute to hour gap you want to fill. It works for 2 to 4 players, and it's a lot of fun to play because, like I said, as you play the game, you're going to see these monuments, these sites in Egypt get built up. You're going to be building the pyramids. You're going to see the obelisk actually get stacked up high. So it's a really fun, just satisfying game to play with a group. By the end, win or lose, at least you still get contribute to the sites of Egypt. Next up here, and also similar in complexity, we have the game of Targi. Targi is a really cool worker placement game where on your turn, you're going to put a worker somewhere around the perimeter of the board to take one of those actions. And your opponent will do the same. Targi is actually a 2-player only game. But not only do you take those actions around the perimeter of the board, but you also draw lines to the center of the board and see where your workers intersect. At those spots, you also have access to those cards, whether it's an action you get to take or maybe even a card you can buy. So every single round while you and the other player are placing workers, you're going to constantly be blocking each other out of those spots in the middle while trying to figure out which ones you can use if you can gain access to them. Side note, it's also a really satisfying game that comes in a fairly small box and has a pretty limited number of components, but it gets a lot of gameplay out of it. It's a very strategic game as you kind of decide what resources you have to buy which cards and which spots do you need to go to, but also where do you possibly need to place a worker and block your opponent. The next game up is not only a great worker placement game, but also by far the most beautiful game on the list. And that game is Everdell. Now, don't worry, Everdell is not one of these games that just try to distract you with really good art until you go, oh, it's so pretty, but then forget that the game is actually bad. No, Everdell is actually a really, really solid worker placement game. It's more complicated than the first 2 games I listed, and kind of its special niche is that not only does it have worker placement, but it also has tableau building. So while you're doing the worker placement out on the main board, you're also going to be placing cards in front of you that are kind of like forming your little city. But why that's so cool is lots of the cards you place not only give you victory points, but also give you things like the potential to play more cards for free, or maybe like a discount on resources, or you produce resources now with this card once in a while. So when you first start the game, you only have a few workers, and you place them on the spots on the board, you kind of think, I didn't get much done. Then you go into the next season, you start playing some cards and you place a few more workers and you're like, okay, I got a little more done. But by the end of almost every game I've ever dealt, you have this big explosion where you're like, wow, I have so many resources, I can get so much stuff done. Just the few workers accomplish so much. Because on your turn, you could place a worker, but you can also play a card. So it becomes a really cool blend of trying to decide which spots out there are the best for me to go to right now, but also when do I want to time the cards that I'm playing to get some of the bonuses from them. Now, if you watched my channel much before, you probably already knew that the next game was going to make the list, and that game is Viticulture. I've said many times before that Viticulture is one of my favorite games of all time. It is such a solid game where you are trying to get some vines, plant them in the ground, harvest some grapes, turn them into wine, and ship them off. But you see, most of the things that you want to do, like plant a grape, or build a structure, or build a cellar, or get a card, or fill an order, you have to go to spots on the board to do those things. So you might be thinking, okay, I really need to send a worker to the make a wine spot this turn, but you look over and you see that your opponent probably also wants to do that, but you also want to harvest the field. So you have to prioritize which one of those 2 things you want to do first, because you know your opponent's going to probably do one too. So you're always trying to evaluate what's the most beneficial action out there for you to take right now, knowing that any of those actions could be stolen and taken away from you in future turns. So Viticulture, great game, great looking game, one of the original great worker placement games that we actually have in board gaming. The next game up here is Dune Imperium, which is an absolutely amazing game that you can love whether or not you've ever seen the movies. I know that for a fact because I've never seen the movies, but think the game is awesome. A couple things that make Dune Imperium unique is that on top of the worker placement, on top of the board with a whole bunch of spots that you and the other players are competing for, you're also going to have deck building. You're going to take these actions with a deck of cards where you're going to draw 5 cards every turn, use them the best you can, then draw different cards. As the game goes along, you're going to be acquiring new and more powerful cards. So it kind of has the viticulture, big board, lots of spots you're going to, but also throws this whole idea of trying to build up a better deck. It also has a battle going on in the corner of the board for every single turn on top of the worker placement. In the deck building, you're trying to decide how many troops you should send out to the battle. But really, even more so than the deck building and the battle, what I really love about Dune Imperium is just how tight it is. It's one of the tightest, most head-to-head worker placement games I ever played, where you're trying to get to 10 points. It seems so simple, but because the points are so hard to come by, you and the other players are really competing over stuff. It's not just kind of like, oh, here's 4 victory points here and here's 3 here, but you're like, I'm trying to get a faction alliance because this will give me 1 victory point. If I can get that 1 victory point here and I can win the battle this turn, I know I can win, but all the other players can see you're trying to do that, so they may be trying to, take your faction alliance away from you. So it just becomes this really tight game where most games of Dune Imperium kind of come down to the very last turn. Now, if you get through those first 2, Imhotep and Targi, kind of the medium-like games, and even through the 3 kind of medium, slightly medium-heavy games, Dune, Viticulture, and Everdell, and you're still like, man, I want something even more complicated, well, Wayfarers of the South Tigris might be the game for you. Wayfarers is a really cool game that, kind of like Dune Imperium, combines a couple different ideas. So you have worker placement, where you're going to be placing your workers around the board. Now, the workers aren't really yours. They can be picked up by other players as you play them out there. But on top of that, you also have dice that are yours. So dice are like secondary workers. You're going to be rolling dice and then choosing action spots on your own board. You're going to be placing dice and taking actions there as well. One thing that kind of sets Wayfarers apart for me is that the goal seems a little more elusive. It's not quite like Dune Imperium or Viticulture, where you can clearly see these are the victory points I'm competing for. It's a little tougher to know when you first start a game of Wayfarers, like, what is the thing you're trying to do right now? You're going to go for like more cards, you're going to try to go for this central thing called the journal track and get points that way, or you're going to try to move through the game quickly, or you're going to try to take your time with victory points. It's a little more open-ended of a game, which I think what leads to maybe some of the complexity. It's not quite as just painfully obvious in the very beginning what you're supposed to do. Also, the rule book is a little bleh. But even with that, I still think Wayfarers is a super fun, interesting game that just gives you a little different take on the worker placement, just a little different feeling from any of the other games that we've talked about today. Now, before I go, I just want to mention real quick that we recently set up channel membership on this channel just to kind of support the growth of the channel as we go forward. If that's something you'd like to do, we do have a few exclusive videos and stuff like that, but for the most part, it's a way of saying like, hey, I like what you guys are doing, keep making more videos, just trying to support the general growth of the channel going forward. But either way, hopefully you enjoyed the video and found it helpful. See ya.